Testing. 1, 2, 3, testing. Okay. Greetings. I'm J.R. Green. I'm the president of the supervisory board for this institution. Welcome to the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Library and Museum. Forbes Library stands on Nonotuck land, and Grace and Calvin Coolidge were born on Abenaki land. So for something a little after the Indigenous Peoples Day, a little note there. The Coolidge Museum is governed by the Coolidge Standing Committee, a subcommittee appointed by the elected trustees of the Forbes Library, of whom we have 2 here tonight, at least. Our meetings are open to the public. Pardon? 3. Okay, good. Our meetings are open to the public, and we welcome visitors and new members. We have 5 subcommittees: nominating, programming and education, marketing and outreach, exhibits, and development. Have been hard at work this year to bring you free public programs, promote the museum, and plan for the future and redesign of this room. You will hear more from 2 of the committee chairs shortly. Last summer, we kicked off the centennial of the Coolidge administration with a 1920s inspired concert by the O-Tones and another concert in June 2024 by the Butterfly Swing Band, both funded by a Massachusetts Cultural Council Festivals grant. They're both available on YouTube, by the way. We also had a panel discussion on the legacy of the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act, which is available on YouTube. And November 14th, we will hold a discussion on the 1924 Immigration Act with a legal historian and journalism professor. Flyers are on the table for that. The President's Book Group completed the journey through 45 presidents in 2023 and began over again in 2024. You are welcome to join in at any time. A new book group called Herstory began in 2024 as participants who completed the President's wish to read women's stories. I want to thank our Coolidge Standing Committee and subcommittee members for their time, talents, and dedication to our 30th President. Stand if you are present, members of the committee. I know several of you here. Russ? Russ is being anonymous here. Okay. Thank you. Thank you to our enthusiastic tour guides, Rich, Eli, and Christine, and research volunteer Susan for providing a great experience to our visitors and scholars. Smith College work-study students are busy behind the scenes with research projects, digitizing and adding materials to our online database, social media, and creating new displays like the election mania in the back corner. So now I turn the program over to Bill Scher, chair of the nominating committee.
Thank you, J.R. My name is Bill Scher. I'm the Vice President of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Library and Museum Standing Committee and Chair of the Nominating Committee. We have several members of the committee whose terms are up, and we want to renominate them for a new term. They include J.R., J.R. Green, myself, Joel McKenzie, Rich Slazik, Rob Weir, and Katie White. Do I have a motion to renominate those people for a new term? Second. All in favor? Any opposed? Congratulations on your terms. We also have a thank you to give to 2 of our members who are stepping down from the committee but have given us many years of dedicated service. Dylan Gaffney, who will continue to serve on 2 of our subcommittees, and Blaze, I never know how to pronounce your last name, Blaze. Bazalian. Who's had decades of service to Forbes Library and will continue in other volunteer roles. So thank you, both of you, for your years of service. And I'm going to turn the program over to Russell Carrier, Chair of the Forbes Library Trustees and Chair of the Coolidge Development Committee.
Thanks, Bill. So before I tell you what the Development Committee has been doing, I think I need to give you a little context so it'll make sense. So what we're hoping to do is renovate this entire museum and update the permanent exhibit. And as you can imagine, that's going to take a lot of money. So as a result of that, we kind of reconstituted a dormant committee, which is our development committee. So the goal that we have with this work is we hope to present a more complete and balanced presentation of Calvin and Grace Coolidge and their times, rather than the current chronological exhibit, which offers little or no analysis. We also hope to do this in an atmosphere that more fully resembles what a modern presidential museum would look like. And some of you might already know this, but the library uses this museum space as the main programming room that we have. So, you know, it has multi-purposes besides just being a museum. With this in mind, as I said, we activated the long-dormant development committee. And the focus for this year was to create the first annual Coolidge appeal, which I'm pleased to announce that we were able to do within a 6-month period. So our goal is to raise $35,000 to hire a consultant to help us design the new space and exhibit. And I'm pleased to announce the following results. We received a $5,000, the first amount that we received was $5,000, and that came from the Coolidge Committee itself by having them re-examine the budget for this year for the Coolidge Museum. And they were able to scrape away $5,000 from the Peter Rao, the Press Pike, and the Rosamond Chester endowment funds, which were bequests to the trustees. We also really luckily got a very generous gift of $10,000, a matching gift from the Friends of Forbes, and we really want to thank them for that. And so far, we've raised towards that $10,000 matching gift over $8,500 from 60 different gifts, which leaves us about a little over $1,400 to go. As soon as we reach that $10,000 match of the Friends of Forbes, the trustees will add the final $10,000 to reach our goal. So we're really hopeful that we're really pretty close on that. So anybody here who hasn't contributed and would like to, we'd certainly be happy to accommodate you, and anybody online the same way. So we hope to select the design consultant in early 2025 and have a completed design plan in hand approved by the trustees by May. We anticipate the final cost to be around $300,000. So the goal of the development committee for the coming year will be to try to come up with that money so that we will be able to get this project out to bid as soon as possible. This is a huge undertaking, especially for this committee. You know, it's nothing like we've ever been involved in before. So we're hoping to achieve this goal by cobbling together a much broader list of possible funding sources so that we will be successful. So I want to thank everybody for coming tonight, and I would like to introduce Bill Scher again, the Vice Chair of the Coolidge Standing Committee and the Chair of also the Programming Committee, who will introduce tonight's main speaker. Thank you.
We meet again. As Chair of the Programming and Education Committee, I want to introduce tonight's speaker, Julie Bartlett Nelson, who is the head of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Library and Museum. Julie has been with Forbes Library since 2004, 20 years, and holds an MS-LIS in Archives Management and a Master's in History. Tonight's presentation, Road to the White House, is inspired by the centennial of Coolidge's election for his own term, which happened in November of 1924. You will learn about Coolidge's 3 decades of public service and the local and state political career that paved the way to his presidency. Please welcome Julie Bartlett Nelson.
Good evening, and welcome to the Coolidge Museum. So if you have not been here before, I encourage you to take a look around after and ask us any questions. And to those of us who are online, please come and visit us anytime. We're happy to give a guided tour virtually or in person. So Calvin Coolidge rode to the White House. We're going to talk about how he went from a farm to Northampton and into the White House, how this shy, introverted son of a farmer became a politician with 3 decades of public service at the local, state, and national level. While I'll give some highlights of his presidency, today I'd really like to focus on his lesser-known earlier career in Western Massachusetts that would put him on the ballot 17 times, running for more offices than any other president. So here we have John Calvin Coolidge, born July 4th, 1872 in Plymouth Notch, Vermont, a small rural farming community between Ludlow and Woodstock. And in these photos, we have Calvin at about age 2 and age 7. The parents, John and Victoria, shown here about the time of their marriage, and they would also welcome daughter Abigail 3 years after Calvin. They lived in a 5-room cottage attached to the rear of the general store that the father had run. In 1876, Colonel John Coolidge, as he was referred to for his time in the state legislature, in the state militia, would purchase this farmhouse here, which today is known as the Coolidge Homestead. And this is across the street from the general store. Today, the state of Vermont owns this, along with 12 other buildings that are open to the public. And you can tour that from the middle of May to the middle of October. And if you are local to us in Northampton, you can check out a pass to visit for free with your library card. It's here he would become the Vice President of the United States in 1923. So you can also, when you tour the home, be able to see where that occurred. And they do have that recreated back to 1923. In addition to farmer and storekeeper, John was in the state legislature, county tax collector, and a notary, and would push his son to pursue a formal education and instill in him a devotion to public service, community, and the common good. Calvin and Abby attended a 1-room village schoolhouse while working on the farm as well. And you can actually tour that schoolhouse building just up the road from this farmhouse. The children would help on the farm, haying, bringing grain, husking corn, making maple syrup, and hunting and fishing on the property. Calvin's teen years would later be marked with grief with the death of his mother when he was 12, and 5 years later with his sister of appendicitis. Abby had been studying in the local schoolhouse and had passed the teacher exam and was an assistant teacher in the schoolhouse at the time of her death. Calvin would leave the schoolhouse in Plymouth Notch and attend Black River Academy in nearby Ludlow. He would board with a family during the week and come home to the farm on the weekends. He took the classical course of Latin, Greek, history, and math, and his teachers and father would encourage him to pursue a college education. In the spring of 1891, he attended St. Johnsbury Academy as a finishing year in order to pass the entrance exam to college, and he would pass the Amherst exam and enter in the fall of 1891. This portrait is him at the time of his Black River Academy graduation from high school. His arrival at Amherst College we see depicted here with him as a freshman and then as a senior. Calvin would later say in a speech as a state senator, "Education is to teach men not what to think, but how to think." And that's how he viewed his service, in his public service as well. Coolidge enjoyed college life despite his extreme shyness and introverted personality. He would join the debate team and also speech team and become quite the orator at the college level and win several awards. It was here at Amherst that he met alums and lawyers Henry Field and John Hammond, who would hire him as a clerk in their Northampton law firm, and in 1895 moved to Northampton, which was the county seat for Hampshire County and a city of about 15,000 people at that point. This photo is Northampton around 1900. You can see the downtown Main Street still looks quite the same, minus the trolley cars and the carriages. But we still had this really beautiful wide Main Street, and many of these buildings' facades are still there today, as well as the church, First Church steeple. Coolidge clerked and read law with Hammond and Field and would pass the bar exam in 1897. He did not go to a traditional law school, so where did he study? His public library. So Field was a trustee here at the Forbes Library, one of the first, and named in the will of Judge Charles Forbes, who's our benefactor to this building, which opened in 1894. Coolidge moved to town in 1895 to study law, and what better place to do it than here at the public library? At that point, we were this new concept of open browsing stacks and a fully circulating collection, which most libraries at that time, you had to page books and only use them within the library. So young Calvin Coolidge studying had access to Judge Forbes's personal law books that were left here, as well as the entire collection of this new library. And he would spend hundreds of hours here studying. So the public library became a key part of his legal career and creating a lifelong relationship and connection, and later work with the library director to donate papers here to what is now the only presidential library in a public library and not part of National Archives or any federal funding system. In Northampton, the mentors Henry and Field would introduce him to the local political scene. In 1897, he became a member of the Republican City Committee for his ward, and in 1898, elected to the city council. Even as quite the introvert, he was seen as smart, honest, dependable, and quickly became well-liked in the business and political circles of Northampton. This photo is Coolidge around 1898 when he opened up his own law practice. So he would open a solo practice on 25 Main Street called the Masonic Building, and that is still there today. It's still an office building, and his suite was up on the second floor of the building. 1900 and 1901, City Council would elect him as the city solicitor. But in 1902, he lost that bid for city solicitor. Would be the first real loss in his political career. And then he went back to focus on his private practice, where he willingly helped all, including the poor and women. We do know in his legal record books that we have here in the collection, there are many notations where either accepted no payment rendered, and he was providing services knowing he would not ultimately accept any payments for. He would work for the Nunatak Savings Bank, both serving as the vice president of their board and also doing legal work for the bank as their attorney, and what today we'd call loan modifications to avoid foreclosures, and that he became quite well known for. And Nunatak became the primary mortgage lender under his tenure there. 1903, at the insistence of Henry Field, who thought it might help his law career, Coolidge got himself appointed clerk of the courts for Hampshire County to fill a vacancy as the prior clerk had passed away. He would do this for the rest of that term, but decided not to run again in 1904 and go back to politics and become chair of the city Republican Committee. This advertisement is from the 1899 city directory for Northampton, and this would be the first time he would put in a paid advertisement into the directory for his law office. So meanwhile, while Coolidge is here building his law career, in 1902, Grace Goodhue is graduating from the University of Vermont with a teaching degree, and she would find her way here to Northampton to join a friend and teach together at the Clark School for the Deaf. She had visited the prior year, and her friend, who was a year ahead of her at UVM, had come down to teach, and her friend's aunt was the headmistress of the school. So it was well known in Burlington about the Clark School. And she would ultimately teach there for 3 years. In 1904, at Clark, she lives in a dorm and tends to a rose garden just outside her building. And across the courtyard from there, in a Clark building, was a room rented to a young lawyer, Calvin Coolidge, who was the best friend of a Clark employee, Rob Weir. They would later get friends to introduce themselves to each other, as he was too shy to approach the pretty girl in the garden. They married at her parents' home in Burlington, Vermont in October 1905. In his autobiography, Calvin would say, "A man who has the companionship of a lovely and gracious woman enjoys the supreme blessing that life can give, and no citizen of the United States knows the truth of that statement more than I. We thought we were made for each other. She was born with my infirmities, and I have rejoiced in her graces." In 1905, Coolidge would lose his first and only ballot election, and that would be for school committee. He is running, and his opponents, as well as voters, were asking, why do you want to run? Why do you want to be on the school committee? You don't have any children. What's your interest in the schools? And he ultimately loses the election, and when he's asked, just why he's running, and he says, well, I just got married, give me a chance to have some children. And 9 months to the day he lost that election, the first child is born. This is Grace with son John, who's born in 1906, and later they would welcome Calvin in 1908. In 1907 and 1908, just one-year terms back then for both local and state offices. Coolidge would run and become state representative from Hampshire County. He would choose not to run for the third year to come back home and spend time with his young family. At that point, legislature was in session about 4 months a year, and he would rent a room at the Adams Hotel across the street from the State House and take a train from Northampton to Boston, usually on Monday mornings, come home on Friday nights while they were in session. And he'd spend the rest of the year here at home in Northampton in his full-time law practice. So he does maintain a very active practice while still serving in the State House. This is Coolidge's mayor photo. So he would run in 1910 and 1911, serve as mayor of Northampton. At that time, a very part-time job as well, and he still continued a full-time law practice. As mayor, he lowered taxes and city debt, improved the streets, and we began to pave the roads. Prior to that, we had McAdam roads, which are known as kind of a packed gravel, and so he's starting to pave some of the main streets in Northampton. He's installing new sidewalks, widening and improving sidewalks, and electric lights throughout downtown Northampton, and electrifying city buildings and schools. Converting from gas to electricity was one of his big projects. He would later feel the call back to the State House, though, and in 1912 became state senator for 4 one-year terms. In 1914 and 1915, he'd serve as Senate president, and this is him in the Senate in this photo. He was elected bipartisan from both parties, elected him almost unanimously as Senate president. We do have in the back of this room, if you look, there are 2 chairs in the back corner. The taller one was from his time as a senator, and the small, plain, shorter one is his time as a state representative. In the state legislature, he'd advocate for pensions for retired teachers and widows, a 6-day work week, and shorter hours for women and children. safety and medical care in factories. He would serve on a committee that investigated the Bread and Roses strike, as well as several other smaller incidents within factories in the state of Massachusetts. And really what became more modern OSHA laws were instituted in Massachusetts. And we became known as among the strictest safety standards for labor and workers at that time. He'd also advocate for women's suffrage, and the vote would come at the state level twice. In 1909 and 1911, they were trying to bring ballot questions for women voting in Massachusetts. They would fail by the Democratic Party. So we have a flip-flopping of parties from then to now as well. And we had a bigger movement when he is lieutenant governor and governor for suffrage, and they sort of dropped the issue as the national movement took hold and would pass in 1919. This family photo, we have John on the left and Calvin Jr. on the right for the children. This is from 1916 when he's lieutenant governor, and this would be used frequently in the lieutenant governor and governor campaign materials. And I have to say this is probably my favorite family photo in our collection as well. So you may see this frequently from us. 1916, 1917, and 1918, he'd serve as lieutenant governor. Again, those offices were just one-year terms, and they were constantly running for re-elections. His time as lieutenant governor is almost a full-time job, but he's only in Boston for about 9 months of the year during the week, still coming home weekends, and then they'd have the summer kind of off from Senate sessions, and he'd be at home full-time or visiting his father on the farm in Vermont. This is one of his advertisements when he ran for governor, and their slogan was "A square deal to all." He'd run for governor in 1918 as the governor was not seeking re-election. And we'd see this pattern for him come up a few times where he ran for the office because there was no incumbent. And so it opened up the doors for him. And he's sworn in as governor January 2nd, 1919. And you see in the crowded photo, he's down there with the oath. And then, of course, the photo they would stage for the press just outside the room. So 1919 and 1920, he'd serve as the governor of Massachusetts. And I have given several hour-plus long talks on each year by themselves. So I'll give you kind of a quick summary today of what those are, but certainly happy to always talk more about each of those very busy years for him. In Coolidge's 1929 autobiography, he would say, "The 2 years I served as governor were a time of transition from war to peace. New problems constantly arose. Great confusion prevailed. Nothing was settled, and it was possible only to feel my way from day to day. But they were years of progress, if partly in a negative way. The new position of the wage earners was perfected and solidified. A 48-hour week for women and minors was established by a bill by the General Court, which I signed. The budget system went fully into effect the first year I was governor and helped keep the state finances in good condition. The departments were reorganized and the street railways were given relief." And at that point in 1919, we are just have completed World War I, and inflation rates are 20% with stagnant wages leading to widespread labor unrest. Nationwide, there would be over 4 million, or 1/5 of the total workforce, would go on strike during 1919. In Massachusetts alone, there were 396 labor strikes in 1919, so over one a day. And I know one of our board members, who's a labor historian, also loves to give talks on this particular year alone of more strikes than any other year in American history. During the years of 1915 to 1919, we'd seen food prices more than double and clothing costs more than triple. So just a few parts of most people's daily budgets. And in 1919, the Boston police would go out on strike. This would be an issue that would start with the previous governor to him and continue. We have his famous quote here on the screen: "There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime." And he would publish this in the press, and it was a telegram to Samuel Gompers of the AFL-CIO union. This would be used many times in later strikes, and particularly got attention when Reagan used this quote in an Air Force air traffic control strike later. September 1919, though, with the Boston police out on strike, we had seen earlier that year Montreal, Seattle, and Baltimore police attempt to unionize and strike as well. So they're not the first major city police out on strike that year. But Coolidge would gain international headlines for his handling of the strike. For police officers, after 60 years of failing to gain raises, so more than half a century. Oops, oh my, sorry, I just hit the wrong button. They had not had a raise. They're paying for their own uniforms and equipment, and poor working conditions in the stations. They were working 73 to 98 hours per week, and the police were fed up and done. They had been negotiating with the previous 5 governors, previous mayors, and begging for relief and assistance. After many months of negotiation attempts failed with the mayor of Boston, who controlled the budget, the commissioner, who hired and fired and trained workers, and the commissioner is appointed by the governor, not by Coolidge, but his predecessor. And so you have kind of a circle that doesn't meet over who is in charge of the police. A commissioner appointed by the governor who has no say in the budget as well. So after workers were appealing to the mayor, to the commissioner, and the governor receiving no assistance, they attempted to form a formal union with the AFL-CIO, and the commissioner denied those attempts. Coolidge does appoint a commission to study the issue of whether the police can form a union, called the Sturrow Commission, and James Sturrow, if you've ever driven on Sturrow Drive in Boston, named for him, was the head of that commission. And so that went on in early 1919 with the Sturrow Commission, which their findings summarized that the police could form a union, but it needed to be a separate independent union, not part of a national union. When that came out, Coolidge supported the findings of that, but the commissioner did not, and still denied the rights to form a union. So by time we hit September 1919, when the commissioner denies the Sturrow Commission, 1,100 police officers and all the staff walked off the job. Coolidge would bring out the state guards and declare this no right to strike. For Coolidge, he does feel there's sort of no options. He's very limited in what he can actually do for the police. He can't give them anything they want because he doesn't control the money for that. And we also do not have a state police force. So when there is no police and chaos is looming, he does bring out the state militia. As a result of this, the state of Massachusetts forms a state police force in 1921. There is a project that was done launched in 2019 on the centennial of this by University of Massachusetts Boston, and they had done a 5-year research project looking to try to document all 1,100 police officers and police staff and researching who they were. They had union cards signed, so they had the names of everyone, and they attempted to research and put into a public online database who all the people were. what happened to them after the strike and what jobs they may have got or where they moved to. So hundreds of volunteers were assembling that research project. And so I definitely encourage you to take a look at that and find out more of who the workers were. So 1918 election, prior to the strike, Coolidge would barely win his term as governor. But by 1919, in December, when he's running for re-election after the strike, he does lose Boston and Suffolk County, but he overwhelmingly won the rest of the state for re-election. And so again, when you think there is a labor strike more than one a day in the state, the public sympathy and empathy is gone at that point for people, as most of the time their daily life was interrupted by some sort of strike, whether telephone workers, trolley workers, street railways, sanitation, would disrupt them at some point, and they had very little empathy for strikers at that point. This photo is from 1920, July 27th, what would be called Notification Day. So Coolidge thought that the strike would really end his career. He thought he would quietly go back home to Northampton, go back to practicing law, and instead he would reap praise and gain national fame, which would propel him even further up the political ladder. 1920, he would be nominated for vice president along with Warren Harding for president. After the national conventions, so at that point, the parties and the delegates are the only ones at the conventions, and the candidates are not there themselves. So a very different process than we see today. And they had what they called the hometown notification days. And so the delegates would come and assemble in Northampton. They would knock on the door and hereby declare him the nominee. And at that point, that day, we had a parade throughout Northampton, and over 20,000 people would be in town to witness this historic occasion and his acceptance speech, which he would give on Allen Field at Smith College. So if you're familiar with our neighborhood here on West Street, it would be just down the road what's now the field house at Smith College. That was all open field, and that's where he'd give his speech. And in the exhibit case right behind JR, there are some photos of that field and that event as well. So I encourage you to take a look after. Harding's hometown notification was the week before his, and so Coolidge we would have later at the end of July. And this is the family on the front steps of their 21 Massasoit Street Northampton house, and they're assembling for the crowds and the delegates' notification. In the photo of the children, John is on the left and Calvin Jr. is on the right. And it's a rare photo of the whole family smiling. So we see Coolidge often with a very stoic face and frequently not a big grin like this. So a rare one for our collection of over 5,000 photos we have here. In 1920 election, we would have women voting for the first time. And by the 1924 convention, they were requiring there would be a female delegate from every state at that convention, so playing a key role as we move into voting for women. Here in this photo, we have Grace Coolidge and Calvin Coolidge putting their ballots in the box. This photo is actually staged outside of City Hall, so you can see the stones are actually the front of City Hall, and this is out on the sidewalk. We have some other photos of actually inside by the voting booths, but this is what would go out to the press of the vice presidential nominee and his wife in her first federal election. As vice president, Coolidge would preside over the Senate, and he took a very active, serious role in that, where some other previous presidents mostly would attend votes as the tiebreaker if needed, or they would only be there on voting day. And Coolidge spent almost every day he was able to be at the Senate. And so it's unique for him in that we see a lot of his voice in the congressional record and the transcripts, and we see much more of him speaking on the Senate floor as vice president than he ever could have as president. So we hear a lot more of his voice on particular votes during that time as well, which is unique for him. As vice president, he's also at cabinet meetings, and so this is the first time a vice president is involved in day-to-day cabinet operations as well. And that's a Harding change to bring the vice president into the cabinet meetings. In August 1923, Harding dies. He is on a planned trip that was part vacation and part planting the seeds for his next campaign. He'd been in Alaska, and then he was in Washington and then California, and so he dies in San Francisco. Coolidge is on a planned 3-week vacation to his father's farmhouse in Vermont. Just Calvin and Grace are on that trip, not the children. And he's getting updates and telegrams of Harding's health, warning him about, Harding not doing well. But nobody thought it was fatal at that point. And in the tiny little farm town of Plymouth Notch, there is no telegraph station and there is no phones. So they are delivering telegrams and messages from neighboring towns as well. So the communication at that point is very slow. So Coolidge gets there's a telegram for him that comes in at 2 o'clock in the morning of Harding's death. And so it's the telegraph owner who called the owner of the phone company and woke him up out of bed, and his wife. And the telegraph owner and the telephone company owner drive out to the farmhouse with this fatal telegram and deliver it, knocking on the door at 2 o'clock in the morning, waking everybody up to the news that Coolidge is now the president of the United States. This painting, which is also up here on the wall here, and this depicts the oath of office that night. So 2:47 a.m., Coolidge is sworn in by his father by lamplight in the family living room with the Coolidge family Bible on the table. There's no photographs of this event. We know from some firsthand accounts who was there, and there are a few paintings that have been recreated of this event. Coolidge goes back to bed, and Secret Service are all awoken and start making logistics and plans for his return to Washington and for his travel as well. And the nation would wake up to the newspaper headlines of Harding and Coolidge. When asked later, when his father's asked later, how did you know you could swear him in? And his answer is, well, no one told me I couldn't. So we do have Coolidge. He's not the first accidental president through death, but there's still not a clear sort of procedure of what were to happen. They knew he needed to be sworn in, but they didn't really know by who and where and how. So this oath by his father becomes quite the notable event. It's been a Jeopardy question many times. And so if you ever find yourself at pub trivia, you'll find that it's Coolidge is the only one sworn in by his father. Later, he is sworn in again by a federal justice, Justice Howling in Washington, D.C., as many people would question the legality of his father's oath. His father was only a notary, and so he was not a federal official. So the children are not in Vermont with them, so where were they hiding that summer as well? And we have In these photos, we have John Coolidge on the left, and he is at a Army training camp at Camp Devens in Massachusetts, which would be like a junior ROTC type program today. He'd spent 3 summers there in total, and so he is there in August of 23. And Calvin Jr. in this photo here is picking tobacco at a farm in Hatfield, Massachusetts. He's living on the Massasoit Street home with a housekeeper for that summer. The prior summer, he was working picking onions, but in 23, he would pick tobacco as it paid more money. So he worked here. This is the Dickinson and Day farm in Hatfield. And the summer with the onions, he was at the Belden farm, also in Hatfield. And he would take either a wagon ride from downtown Northampton with some other employees, or they would get on a trolley to the edge of town and then get picked up there as well. What's fun is the press caption for the farm photo read, "Coolidge's son keeps $3.50 job while father enters White House." While President Coolidge is in his temporary presidential quarters, Calvin Coolidge Jr. is hard at work under hot sun in the tobacco field at Dickinson and Day Farm. Calvin Jr., just 14 years old, attired in khaki trousers and an old shirt and well-worn shoes, is working for $3.50 a day. The day is 9 full hours. Young Calvin says that the elevation of his father's presidency would make no changes in the Coolidge's mode of life. And later, in many newspaper accounts, a young worker remarked to Coolidge, "If my father was president, I would not work in a tobacco field." And Calvin Jr.'s famous reply, similar to his own father's wit, would say, "If my father were your father, you would." John Coolidge would go on to attend Amherst College, like his father, graduating in 1928, and he would marry Florence Trumbull, who was a Mount Holyoke graduate from 1927, and her father was the governor of Connecticut. Their fathers knew each other as neighboring state governors, and it would be their fathers and Secret Service that would introduce the pair to each other in 1925. And they would date throughout their college years, and they got married in the fall of 29 after the White House years. Calvin Jr. Died in July 1924 at the beginning of the presidential election campaign after getting a blister on his foot. He'd been playing tennis on the White House lawns with no socks in his shoes and developed this blister. It would lead to septicemia, and he would die of blood poisoning at age 16. That death would take a heavy toll on both Calvin and Grace Coolidge after that. And Coolidge, later in his autobiography, would say, when he went, the power and the glory of the presidency went with him. So filled with grief, he did very little campaigning that summer. So he's received that nomination to run for his own term just a few weeks earlier in June. And he had many campaign stops planned that he cancels. And here we see in this photo, his father is the one who did far more campaigning than him. So his father, John Coolidge, sets off on this caravan from Vermont to the Midwest along the Lincoln Highway, campaigning. And so they leave from Plymouth Notch, Vermont, Coolidge's hometown, to Evanston, Illinois, which was Charles Dawes, the vice presidential nominee, his hometown as well. And so they would link those two together. And this is the van that left from Vermont. And we see their little slogan here is "Two common sense Americans, Coolidge and Dawes." And we see in the Republican Party, Harding was from Ohio and Coolidge from Massachusetts. And so their big voting blocks were the Northeast and Midwest. And they repeat that pattern in 24, nominating Dawes from Illinois. And he'd been a senator and a banker. And Coolidge himself, he would do many what they called the whistle-stop campaigns from the back of a train car when he was traveling. He did several regional campaign stops and made a trip to Vermont and campaigned in New England later in August of 24, but he did very little campaigning outside of those areas as well. For Coolidge, he is the first on the radio. And so here we do have what is considered the first audio and video campaign speech for Coolidge. And so if you've never heard his voice, which is really fun, we'll just play a little snippet of the speech. So he gives this speech on the White House lawn. It's about taxes, and it's considered the first audio and video campaign speech of a president. It is about 4 minutes long, but I'll just play you a little bit so you can kind of hear his voice.
The country needs every ounce of its energy to restore itself. The costs of government are all assessed upon the people. This means that the farmer is doomed to provide a certain amount of money out of the sale of his produce, no matter how low the price to pay his taxes. The manufacturer, the professional man, the clerk must do the same from their income. The wage earner, often at a higher rate when compared with his earning, makes his contribution, perhaps not directly, but indirectly, in the advanced cost of everything he buys.
So you can hear he's got quite sort of a old New England voice and sort of a very unique Vermont accent as well. So it's sort of fun. And in here we also have, we don't have teleprompters yet. So he's got his little cards in front of him as well. And everyone comments that he's got a crooked tie, that no one fixed his tie before he went on camera. But so this first speech, Harding does use the radio to broadcast from the Oval Office, and that reached regional circles around Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia. But Coolidge would be the first to broadcast nationally on the radio from the Oval Office. And he does use the radio from the Oval Office more frequently than even FDR. So at that point, about 2 to 3 minutes, where technology-wise and also personality-wise, we get to FDR with like 30 to 40 minutes fireside chats on the radio. The 1925 inauguration would be the first inaugural speech broadcast nationally on the radio as well. So his embrace of technology would be quite an accomplishment for 1920s. We also have him giving press conferences 3 to 5 times a week himself. By the time we get to Eisenhower, he starts using a press secretary, and that model would continue after him. But Coolidge holds the record for more press conferences per number of days in office delivered by him than any other president. So despite the press nickname of Silent Cal, he is anything but silent. So I hope that would be the most important thing you take away today. This photo is used quite a bit. This is a fun one. This is him on the porch of the Massasoit Street home, and this is 1929 post-presidency. So they leave office, and he quietly retires, or attempts to quietly retire, back to Northampton. And the little dogs on the porch, they get quite famous in a lot of photos, but the white collie on the left would be named Prudence Prim, and the black chow on the right was named Tiny Tim. They were at the White House, and they returned back home here to Northampton, and they would be frequently photographed all over Northampton. For Coolidge in 1928, he decides not to run again and chooses retirement. At that point, we hadn't had a president serve more than 2 terms, And because he had served a year and a half of Harding's as well as his own, it was a little bit unknown, could he run again, and did he want to? And so he decides in the summer of 27 that he will not run again. He famously passes out a slip of paper to the press that was handwritten, "I do not choose to run," in 1928. And he would not do a press conference. He would take no questions, and they were just to print this simple one sentence that he was not running. Lots of questions of why was he not going to run? And he kind of doesn't really ever give an answer as to why, but his consistent response to, well, what are you going to do now, is retirement. So he's clear that after over 3 decades of public service, that he is going to quietly retire from the political scene as well. A lot of speculations about his health, his mental health, or his wife's, that he will never really confirmed or denied as to what that issue was. He does address the timing of his announcement. So in summer 27, to talk about a fall 28 election was unprecedented, to be talking about it that far ahead of time, where now we're frequently talking 4 and 8 years in advance. And he does address that in that he wanted to make sure that the party, and as well as potential candidates, knew there would be no incumbent. And so again, we saw that in some local and state offices that he ran for because there was no incumbent. So he really wanted to pave the way for his successor at that point. When asked in the months following if he would reconsider, his answer was always no. And he also reiterated the following spring that if nominated, he would not accept it. So he was definitely not going to seek another term. He does come home here to Northampton, March 1929. They returned to the Massasoit Street rented duplex, and then they purchased a home in 1930 that was called the Beeches for all the beech trees on the property, and that is over off Hampton Terrace in Northampton. It is there at the Beeches that he dies in 1933, and Mrs. Coolidge would sell that home in 1937, and she built herself a new home in 37 off of Washington and Ward Avenue off of Elm Street, kind of back in that Massasoit neighborhood. And she would name her home Road Forks. For obvious reasons, as you went down the road, it was where it forked. And it's a white brick colonial she wanted to, inspired by a Georgetown townhouse, is how she wanted that to look. The homes are all still there today. They're just privately owned, with a small little plaque on them, so there's nothing here in Northampton to tour for their homes. So while Coolidge might be known as a fiscal conservative for a balanced budget with a surplus, reducing size of federal government, paying off war debts, reducing taxes back to pre-war levels, and even lower for many lower income families, he's also states' rights, for small federal government and a lot of power to the states. He's progressive in many other ways for women's rights, civil rights, veteran affairs. He speaks at Howard University and is giving federal funds to start a black medical college at Howard. He is pushing for anti-lynching bills every year of his administration, and he is hiring African-American veterans in civil service jobs when Wilson had denied that access. And so he is pursuing many things we'd see as more progressive today as well. And one other very fun connection to Northampton is this gentleman here. And so how did Coolidge get around town in retirement? He would purchase his Lincoln limousine from the federal government. So a 1924 Lincoln limousine was delivered back home here to Northampton, and he would never actually drive it. He had a chauffeur. And so this gentleman here would be seen all around town doing errands for both of the Coolidges and driving them around and serving as a bodyguard because we did not have Secret Service for life at that point. So this chauffeur is named John Bukowski, and he's here posed in front of the Massasoit Street home. And he would work for the family from 1929 until Mrs. Coolidge's death in 1957. So he would work for Mrs. Coolidge at her Road Forks home. He actually lived there in a little suite on the back of the garage for many years as well, and served as her handyman, house caretaker, butler, personal assistant. And we have many letters between Mrs. Coolidge and Bukowski around travel plans, instructions for specific tasks, and she even sent him with the cash in the name of her friend to purchase her a new car. And so he's handling many financial transactions for her as well. At that point, they would not sell a car to a woman, and she was also afraid if they knew it was her, she would be charged more money. So in the name of her friend, he was sent on a train to New York to purchase her that vehicle. So those letters are fun to read in our collection as well. So I do encourage you to get in touch if you want to do some research as well. And so Bukowski, he grows up on a farm in Hatfield, which is just north of us here in Northampton. And he and his parents and siblings had emigrated from Czechoslovakia and set up farming here in the valley. And he would leave the farm and start working as a mechanic, first fixing farm machinery and then cars as well. And he got himself hired as a driver for a Smith College faculty and then a dean, and who would introduce him to Mrs. Coolidge, and she later stole him as her chauffeur. And so this would be the car that would be seen around town. Everybody recognized and knew this vehicle and would get out of the way for it. And when we raise the screen in a few minutes, these are the presidential portraits that are behind this screen. And these probably, I think, are my favorite piece in our collection for artwork. Presidential portraits painted in 1924 by Howard Chandler Christie. And Christie was known as a portrait artist. He would later do a lot of magazine work and became known as the Christie Girls, competing with the Gibson Girls in 1940s, 30s magazine advertisements. And he painted these at the White House. He was hired by Mrs. Coolidge's University of Vermont. She had started a female fraternity. So the fraternity hires Christie to paint these, and the fraternity gifted this set to the couple. So they hung at the White House from 24 to 29, and then in 29, they gifted these portraits to Forbes Library. And so they have hung on this wall for nearly 100 years now. Christie designed them to face each other, so to be hung side by side looking at each other. Christie does complete a second portrait of Mrs. Coolidge that the fraternity gifted to the White House, and that is still at the White House today. It's a full-length portrait of Mrs. Coolidge with the White House in the background, and she is in a red dress with her white collie dog named Rob Roy, depicted in that. And that is in the China Room today. And that particular room in the White House, it is on the part of the public tour, so if you ever get to the White House tour, you'll see it. And Jackie Kennedy had remodeled that room in all red fabric around that portrait. So Grace is quite the feature in the White House still today. And that concludes us. So if you are watching at home, I do encourage you to come visit us anytime. For those of us that are here in person, we do have out in our gallery some refreshments. We have 1920s Coolidge-inspired mocktails for you to sample. Grace Coolidge's Icebox Cookies, which is a famous recipe of hers, old New England style cookie, and the recipes are out there too. And then Plymouth Artisan Cheese, which is made in the cheese factory formerly run by the president's father and then later his son. And you can buy that here in Northampton locally at a few different shops as well. So I encourage you to take some refreshments, and then I can take a few questions if you have any questions for us tonight. Oh. And yes, I saw a hand. Question. Oh, so the question is, how do we spell the last name of the chauffeur? And let's see, in my notes, so Bukowski is Bukosky, and the first name was John. Yep. Anything else for me tonight? Yes. Yeah, so the question is about the economy of 1920 and the Depression there as well. And so for Coolidge, the sort of 1920s, you think of it as the Roaring 20s. It's really quite a myth. It roared for a lot of people, and especially in cities. And a lot of job opportunities had opened up for people during the war, as well as transportation and technology had sort of changed a little bit of culture for jobs. So cities were really booming, but agriculture and rural America was not. And they were in a very deep depression after World War I, as just supply and demand had shifted, prices had shifted. There was a lot of appeals to Coolidge for agricultural relief, for price fixing, for subsidies, and Coolidge vetoed those despite being the son of a farmer. But he really thought that the federal government couldn't set national prices for farm goods, that should be left to the states and the local economy in terms of fixing prices as well. There is some farm relief bills later in the 20s as well, but we do have the start of 1920. You see it with him as governor, and then even as vice president and president. So the early part of the decade, we have really high inflation and really kind of stagnant wages for people at that point. And for Coolidge, he really makes it his mission, and his primary focus was the economy. So he is balancing a budget with a surplus each year. He is also paying back war debts. And so he wants to pay back Liberty war bonds that people had purchased, and he pays them back early and on time as well. And he's cutting government spending to achieve a lot of these things. And in terms of tax, there's a little bit of a myth of how much tax cutting he did, but he does bring it back to pre-war levels. So they had been raised really high during the war years. And then for certain income brackets, he's lowering that even further. And so he finishes his term in 29 with a balanced and surplus budget, and we have inflation back down to near 0%. Oh, yes. So is there a book for this? I would say the best book for economy for that would be the biography Coolidge by Amity Shlaes. She's an economist. That comes out in 2010. And it is quite a lengthy, well-researched book, a little bit of an academic feel to it, but definitely I would say that's probably the best in terms of addressing 1920s economy. There is also a great biography by a classic historian, chronological biography by Robert Sobel from 1990. That would also be a great, sort of different type of author for Coolidge as well. And those would be the two I'd probably recommend for for that topic. Anybody else? All right, well, thank you for coming, and certainly take a peek out in the gallery, grab some refreshments. We do have a flyer for a program in November that's an immigration panel to talk about the centennial of the 1924 Immigration Act with two UMass professors. So grab a handout for that. And we also have donation packets and information as well. And we have a couple of new pins that we created. So we have our Centennial logo pin, and we have a brand new Coolidge Club of Northampton pin, which our work studies were busily making this week as well. So there's a basket of those, so grab yourself some of those to proudly wear around town. So thank you.